Greetings, friends. Wanningerski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of February 24th through March 2nd of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. And this week we have a few updates around the front, and this week we're actually going to start in Kursk. I think we started with Kursk last week as well. So yeah, a lot of updates happening in Kursk. This week, the Russians are cutting off the squeezing the tip of the bulge of the Kursk salient. Now, you might be wondering, what do I mean by that? Well, anyway, so what's happening is that the Ukrainians used to have this giant protrusion, this tip that kind of protrudes from their main Kursk bulge here. So they have this Kursk salient here that centers around the town of Sushka, which is the main center of operations here. But they also had a protrusion that kind of went along this rail line up toward the village of Potogorivki here, and kind of was centered around the village of Malalenovka here. And so, but this week, the Russians are basically completely destroying this tip, squeezing it, and forcing the Ukrainians back towards Suchka. Let's talk about it. So first, what happened was we talked about how last week the Russians entered the village of Porogevki. We had some updates, some rumors of the Russians entering these villages. But this week we have 100% confirmation. We actually have the Russians raising their flags in this village, along with in Orlovka. And so, these villages, which were the tip of the spear for the Ukrainians, have been captured. Not only that, the Russians kept pushing. They have also taken the village of Nova Sharonia. And basically, they're moving down along these chain of villages, along this rail line. And they're now centering around the town of Malalenovka, which is the main stronghold. As you can see here, this is a bit bigger than most. They have a prison colony, and this is where the Ukrainians are going to try and make a final stand. Now, some rumors are saying that the Russians already entered Malalenovka, but we don't have any confirmation of that just yet. But needless to say, the Ukrainian position in this small bulge in the north of Sushka is in a very precarious situation, and the Russians are making rapid progress. Not only that, they're making very much progress in the south, which also puts the positions in Malalenovka in a very precarious situation. They have completely captured the village of Lepinanivka. We don't have any flag raising, but we just got most map updaters have said that. Along with this, we have the Ministry of Defense said the Russians have completely captured the village of Nikolaevsky here. And so, some Russian sources are now saying that the Russians are moving north here, trying to take the village of Lanovka here, and then squeezing out all the Ukrainians from these fields here. And then they could have a front line that goes something along this rail line, and then from here, they could then try to cross, and cut off this road of supply to Malalenovka here. Because all they have to do is cross this this river here, and then they could cut the only road that supplies the Ukrainians in Malalenovka here. And so, this is what I mean by the Russians squeezing the tip, because this protrusion was what the Russians have been fighting over for the last few, during the winter campaign, and it has now completely collapsed. Now, there's a lot of people like, well, why is it collapsing now? Like, what happened? Well, a lot of sources are saying it's because the Russians have, are now squeezing the Ukrainians out of their last line, supply node to Suchka. There's one road. Now, obviously, if they, before I'm getting out of myself here, there's one road that supplies Suchka, this highway here. Now, yes, there's some they could maybe buy, even if they cut this, they could move through the fields here. But obviously, having a highway to supply yourself would be a lot better than moving through open country. But in any case, this is the only supply route. Road supply route that supplies Suchka, and the Russians, having cleared up everything along this border, are now in a very good position to start striking this road with FPV drones, and they've been getting very good at that, and they've been constricting the supply for the Ukrainians in Suchka. And so it's hard enough just to resupply your forces around Suchka, but it's another thing to then having to move them through another road, which is also under a lot of fire control, into this line of villages here. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians lose Malalenovka within this month, and then they fall back towards around Suchka. They fall back and have their positions, something like this. So try to basically the only thing that will be left of the Kursk salient is Suchka and its surrounding suburbs. But I think as I mentioned a few videos ago, I think the Russians have a plan for that. I don't think the Russians are going to storm Suchka directly. I mean, they might, but it looks like the Russians are also trying to put pressure and try to cut and just, force the Ukrainians out of Suchka. And what do I mean by that? So this week, as we mentioned, the Russians have entered Sumy Oblast, and they're continuing their work in taking Suchka in some of these villages. Because here's what needs I talked about this 2 videos ago, I think. But basically, the Russians just need to push down along this line of between the Kursk and Sumy border, and just move along these roads. And basically, all they have to do is reach this highway, and which is the last, it's only about, I think, like 9 kilometers or so from the border. So all the Russians have to do is just move south and then cut it. And so that's what they're doing. So this week most sources are saying that the Russians have taken the village of Novodevki. However, they say that this is actually not enough. As we can scroll down here, it doesn't look like there's actually any town here at all. It looks like it's just a bunch of forest here. So it looks like, a lot of sources are saying that the Russians are having a hard time being able to hold here, as compared to the Ukrainians who are in the village of Basivsky here, who have a lot of places they could hold on to. So if the Russians could take Basivsky, then they'll have a very solid foothold. And then they'll actually only be like, what's this, like 3-4 kilometers from the road? But also, not only that, the Russians are pushing in the village of Zorovka here. And it looks like this is a much more better, there's actually some buildings that the Russians could take cover in here. This seems like a peaceful village, not gonna lie. Like, imagine living, like, in this house or something. Like, you have all these farms and, like, what's this? Like is this like a cemetery or some shit? This looks pretty peaceful. Anyway, the Russians are in Zorovka here, and this village is very elongated. So, most sources are saying that they probably only captured the northern part because it's so elongated. But, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians capture this village. I also wouldn't be surprised if the Russians activate in this area because they have a road that will be a lot easier to supply. And then they'll take the village of Volodymyrivki, and then they could probably try to, use this as their as their flank position to hold. And basically, the main point here would be to capture something like this. So just capture this part of Sumy, and then you'll cut the only road that supplies Suchka. And then obviously we have the Russians still battling for the village of Korolevko, and trying to make a bridgehead on the other side of the Pesel River, which goes something like this, and trying to basically cut off if the Ukrainians are trying to supply themselves through these fields here. So yeah, the Ukrainian position in Kursk is very precarious. The Russians are squeezing. They're now making a lot of progress here, and we shall see if how the Russians develop this. Alrighty, now we're actually going to go to the South Donetsk direction. In the South Donetsk direction, the Russians are also advancing. This is actually where besides Kursk, this is actually where the most interesting things are happening. Now, a lot of these villages are small little villages. It's not like, for example, when we talk about Pokrovsk, we're talking about the big city of Pokrovsk. When we're talking about the Toretsk or Chasiv Yar, these are big cities. It's not as sexy talking about this direction here, even though this is where most of the progress is happening in terms of land captured, because it's like just a bunch of villages. Now, the main purpose, I think I talked about this last week, but the whole purpose of the Russians expanding out of the South Donetsk direction is to basically take the rest of South Donetsk. As you can see, the area kind of goes something like this here. So they're trying to, I think their main goal is to first reach Kamar, which is one of the main logistics centers. It's now the biggest, when you look down, it's not as big as Kharkov or Velikonosolivka. It's obviously, it's basically like a small, a bigger than average village compared to the rest of the villages, but it's pretty small. But anyway, I think the main goal here is to try to outflank Kamar, help the Russians in this other area to outflank Baratar and take these last villages before they reach the Dnieper Oblast. And then the last goal is to reach Zelenia High and reach the Vochka River here, which kind of forms a natural defense, along the borders of the Donbass. And then they'll probably also have, hold their flank in this area right here as well. So, but let's talk about what the Russians have gained here. And this week, they actually made a ton of progress. So first, they've expanded their forces north from Novocherny and have completely captured the village of Suchkina. So everything to the south of this kind of bulge here has been taken by the Russians here. So Suchkina has been captured. We actually have the Russians raising their flag here. And so with the fall of this village, the Ukrainians fell back to Visola. And I wouldn't. And we actually saw last week that the Russians were trying to move also along the Multilaya River to reach the village of Dnieper Energy or whatever. And so, what they might be doing is, just kind of running in tandem. The only problem is the Russians on this end. If they continue moving towards Kamar, the Ukrainians still have positions in these fields, and they could counterattack. So they'll have to. If the Russians want to continue moving north towards Kamar, at least along this side of the Mulkayar River, they'll have to start advancing through the fields towards the village of Ordonata and try to cut this highway between Baratar and Kamar. But anyway, the Russians are at least moving in, on the western side of the Mulkayar River and have taken Sushka. Along with this, one of the main areas where the Russians have been pushing towards it, and they have reached it, is the village of Burlaska here. We have map confirmations that the Russians have taken this village as well. This could give them a small staging position towards as they move towards one of their biggest goals, which is the village of Shintemko. This village right here. As you can see, this is a big village, like Kamar, and this would provide the Russians a lot of good positions to advance further towards Kamar. Along with this, most sources are saying the Russians are moving toward the north of Burlaska and are actually trying to take these fields to the north of it. If they do this, then this will give them a very good position to start outflanking Shintemko from the east, and we shall see how that develops. Along with this, the Russians have taken the village of Prilinia here. Some sort of saying that the cleanup is still underway, but the capture of this village was pretty much guaranteed after the Russians basically outflanked it after they reached Burlaska. Now, the main, what I'm interested in is the village of Zelenia Polia. This is a much bigger village, and it'll be probably a lot harder to take, but if the Russians could take it, then they'll be in a very good position. Because then they basically, after they take Zelenia Polia, they basically took the last part of the defense line that they set up after the fall of Lika Nosovka. So the Russians have taken. If the Russians could take something like this, they have taken the first defense line. Now there's another defense line that goes from Shintenko to Vasola, which are probably trying to hold back the Russians from reaching the western edge of Kamar here. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians keep moving between Vasola and Shintemko, keep moving along the Mulkaya River, and probably for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see the Russians try to consolidate their positions to something like this. And once they do this, the Russians will then be in a secure position to start the battle for Kamar. But they still have, they took one of the main strongholds, and now they're going to the second line of defense, and so, if the Russians continue pushing as have been pushed for the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's going to be very good news for the Russians here. Alrighty, so now we're gonna, and then also I believe they're also going to try to take Zelenia Polia and Novopilia. The main question I have is, right now the short-term tactical goals make sense to me. I wonder how they're going to try to encircle Kamar. Kamar is, there's a lot, they're going to try to encircle it, but how are they going to do that? So if we look at kind of like where the Russians are going to be after the tactical victories, it's going to be something like this. So the Russians are going to take this, but how are they going to take Kamar? So, because they could continue advancing north, but then they also have, all the Ukrainians that are in, in this area that could counterattack them. And then they'll also have, if they try to move towards Ordana, they still have Russians and they still have Ukrainians in Baratar who could counterattack them. And so, there's going to be, I'm wondering like what the Russian strategy is going to be to try to encircle Kamar. But in any case, they're going to have, if they want to take Kamar, they're going to have to expand their flanks a little bit. They have to reach the village of Ordana to cut off this highway. They're going to have to, they'll have to move into the Dnieper Oblast and probably, take a few of these villages that are to the south of this other river here, which forms another line of Ukrainian defense, the Vochka River here, our favorite Vochka River. So they'll probably have to take, probably a lot of these villages here, just to secure their western flank a little bit as they move towards this highway here, and then they could use this river as a natural defense here. And so, but then once they hit Kamar, they'll be in a very good position to continue pushing towards Zelenia High, and then basically help the Russians who are pushing in this direction towards Novopalovka. So yeah, a lot of good advancements in the South Donetsk direction. Alrighty. And then also the last thing I want to talk about is that the battle for Constantinople is still ongoing. The Russians have not cleared it yet. They have not captured it. So this battle has been going on for a while. It's hard, but there's still a lot of clashes here. So we shall see if the Russians are able to finally take Constantinople. So, yeah, let us. But so far, no changes in this direction. So, but we shall see if the Russians are able to capture this village next week. Alrighty, now we're actually going to do a skip and a hop all the way to the Toretsk direction, and this is where the Ukrainians are counterattacking. This week, I want to talk about how about the situation in Toretsk. So it looks like I cursed myself because I called the battle for Toretsk a bit early. You know, when I last left off, the Russians were pushing in the final vestiges of this like coal mine and this area, but it looks like this area is a lot more nebulous than I first assumed. So it looks like the battle for Toretsk is still ongoing because the Ukrainians have counterattacked and they have re-entered Toretsk, and so the battle for it is still ongoing. Now, it's not like a complete collapse. It's not like the Ukrainians have, cut off all the Russians in this area. What it does show is that this is not as secure as the Russians claimed. So everything I would say around this area. So the Russians probably have very secure positions in the, the Toretsk mine in the center of Toretsk, but this entire northern sector with all these like residential areas is like in a gray zone. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians capture it, control it. It doesn't mean that the Russians. But that does also it also means that the Russians aren't exactly like have fortified positions here. So what the Ukrainians have been doing is doing these counterattacks. We still need some confirmation to see like how much more the Russians have done here, and so like how much more of like how much more progress the Ukrainians have here. So, they've been doing these infiltration tactics, and they've actually reached, some sources show that the Ukrainians reached all the way to this area right here. We have some sources showing in the north, mostly in the northern part, that the Ukrainians were getting droned in this area, and they actually reached all the way up to the border of the center of Toretsk here. So the Russians are in a very precarious, so you might be wondering, well, what happened here? Well, my guess is that after the fall of Toretsk, the Russians started doing a regrouping. After they win a battle, they usually do a regrouping, and because they pulled out a bunch of forces, the Ukrainians did a counterattack and have been able to infiltrate it. And so it looks like the battle for Toretsk is still ongoing. This probably explains why they've not been trying to advance towards Novospassky or Sherobrenka or towards Dachshunds, because they still have positions in Toretsk that they have to battle for. So, there's still a bunch of unknowns of what's happening here. But a lot of Russian sources are saying these are infiltration teams that have been wiped out and they retreated. But we have to follow to see if how much more, because we actually had another geolocated footage of the Russians being bombed in this mine here. So it does show the Russians are. It's not that the Russians aren't in this northern area. It's just that they're so spread thin that the Ukrainians are able to infiltrate. So the battle for Toretsk is still ongoing. The Ukrainians have infiltrated it, and we have to still monitor to see how much more can the Ukrainians infiltrate and how much can they consolidate? Because sending a few teams in for photo ops is not enough. They have to actually send a good force here. And we shall see if the Ukrainians are able to hold on to these positions here. Alrighty. So yeah, that's Toretsk. This is actually where the Ukrainians have a bright spot. It looks like the battle for Toretsk is still ongoing. It is back from the dead. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Pokrovsk direction. We kind of made a bit of a skip between these areas. In the Pokrovsk direction, there's actually not been much changes. There's a lot of clashes going on for Kolnia and Peshana. But the Ukrainians claiming that they captured these villages are for PR. The Russians are still in this area. But clashes are still ongoing, but no changes on the big map. But where there has been changes is in these fields between the South Donetsk and Pokrovsk direction. So the main thing, first off, is the Ukrainians did a counterattack and forced the Russians out of most of Uspenivka. Pro-Ukrainian sources said they have recaptured the entire village. Russian sources are saying that they still have positions in the most eastern part. But in any case, we now know that Uspenivka is still being contested. Some pro-Russian sources said they captured it, but it looks like that was they got pushed back from it. So, battle for Uspenivka is still ongoing. This is probably going to be one of the biggest battles of the war for Uspenivka. So the Russian push in this kind of northern sector here has slowed down. However, the Russians have made a bit more progress is in the center here, and we have geolocated confirmation that the Russians have completely captured the village of Zaporozhye. We talked about this last week, but this means they're now in the southern part of the village of Perebrozhenevka here. And not only that, we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians have captured these fields to the north of this village. And so I wouldn't be surprised if within like a week or so that the Russians try to exploit their advantage and take this village right here. and then they could have some good positions, something like this here. And so, with the capture of this village, then they'll have they could have a new defense line between Nadivka and Srebrenica, and then they just need to do one more push towards these last villages before they reach the Dnieper Oblast. But they might stop because the Russians still have not cleared the south, they have not cleared the north. So if they want to continue pushing towards the Dnieper Oblast, then they'll have their flanks exposed. So after they capture this village, unless they try to clear up, the fields to the south, or they manage to take Uspenivka and start advancing along the river here, they might stop here. But the Russians are now encircling the village of Brushenevka here. Alright. Let us now go to the Chasiv Yar direction. This is where the Russians have made some progress. Slow, steady progress. We're kind of going back to 2023 here, early 2024, where the Russians have small progress, but now we have to talk about it. The Russians are improving their positions in this kind of like area here in the front of Mykolaiivka here, and this week the Russians have taken more of these like fortifications to the north of this village here. The Russians are going to try to basically break into this village to try to cut off the roads that supply center Chasiv Yar, which is where the main fighting is occurring. But after they took these this forest here, which had a bunch of Ukrainian fortifications, the Russians are now repurposing it. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next push is the Russians are going to try to take this little small industrial area, or maybe it's not an industrial area. I've heard people call it that, but the Russians are going to try to push here and capture this area, which will also support their positions in the front of Stupichki, where the Russians also have positions. And so, if the Russians could take this area, then they'll be in a good position to start attacking Mykolaiivka and Stupichki, which are two villages which are technically not part of Chasiv Yar, but they need to take them to actually secure Chasiv Yar. Just like as taking Toretsk is not enough, they have to take Kilian Balka, Katerinovka, Srebrenica. They need to take all these villages around Toretsk to actually secure it. Because if not, then as we see, just taking Toretsk is not enough. They'll actually, the Ukrainians are still able to infiltrate it. So Chasiv Yar, I think, is just like this center part right here. That's all that's left. So technically, the Russians have most of Chasiv Yar in control. But in order to actually control Chasiv Yar, they have to take Stupichki and Mykolaiivka here. So it's not just, they don't have to just take the center part. They have to take basically something like this here. So they still have a little bit more to go, but technically, in terms of administrative borders, the Russians are making a lot of progress around Chasiv Yar. But in fact, inside Chasiv Yar itself, the Russians we actually have geolocated footage that the Russians have taken these high-rise buildings in front of the factory, which they took a little while ago. But they have taken this area of the center of Chasiv Yar. And if the Russians are still in their positions in the northern part of Chasiv Yar, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to maybe take, these high-rise buildings, or if they try to maybe cut off the Russians or the Ukrainians here, they could try to try to outflank them from here, try to reach this kind of like a beach here. But in any case, this is where the main fighting. If the center, this is the last big, this is like the big stronghold for Chasiv Yar. If the center falls, then the battle for Chasiv Yar is basically over, and then it's just cleanup time. Just like after the fall of the center Toretsk mine and the Terrakons led to the fall of the rest of Toretsk, the fall of the center Chasiv Yar will basically facilitate the fall of Stupichki and Mykolaiivka, and then the Russians will then be able to secure their positions here. But yeah, so small little gains more in the south here, and they're now actually making progress in the center of Chasiv Yar, but the battle for Chasiv Yar is still ongoing. Where should we go now? Let's just go north. There's been no changes in the Seversk direction after the Russians captured Bilogorivka. They captured it, and now it looks like they paused. There's been no changes in the Liman direction after the Russians took Yampolovka and Novolobudivka. It looks like they're consolidating their positions here. And then in the Kupiansk direction, there's only been some small changes, actually. The main thing is, in the north here, as usual, is that the Russians are expanding their Dorishnya bridgehead a little bit. This week, the Russians expanded their positions around Kalinovo, took some fields around it, and are now battling for Globoka, and a lot of Russians also say they're on the outskirts of the village of Kinderdorosivsky here. So this does show that the Russians do have plans to try and encircle Kupiansk from the north here. So but they've only made some small progress this week. So it looks like the Russians are just trying to consolidate their positions here. It's actually kind of interesting, like what the Russians have planned for Kupiansk. You know, it could be that they tried to encircle Kupiansk, or they're trying to like make a big plan to encircle this entire big part of Kharkov right here. But because the advancements in the north here that we reported last week does show that the Russians do have plans to encircle this area, but also the Russian push to the south also shows that they want to encircle Kupiansk. So yeah, another thing to mention here is some sources are saying that the Russians are in the northern part of Kupiansk here. It looks like that the Russians in these fields in Petropavlovka in the fields north, and they've retreated to the fields around Sinkovka, which makes sense. It looks like after the Russian push into the center of Kupiansk here failed, they fell back to better positions in this forest. And so the Ukrainians are still in these forests near Kupiansk, but the Russians aren't. There's just some clarifications between Sinkovka and Petropavlovka in terms of where the Russians and Ukrainians are at. Alrighty, now you might be wondering, oh, is that the end of this area? Actually, no. We're actually going to go to the Zaporozhye and Kherson directions, which actually had some updates this week, which usually we don't, so we actually have some updates here. The main thing in the Zaporozhye direction is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Petakivki. We actually have the Russians racing their or I think maybe they're getting bombed here, but they were getting bombed in Petakivki, which shows that the Russians are in this position. I wouldn't be surprised if next the Russians keep pushing north and try to take the village of Lubovka and try to basically, because once they take Lubovka, then they would have repelled, taking back everything the Ukrainians took in their counteroffensive a year ago. So yeah, they have taken Petakivki. I don't know what the purpose of this offensive here is. Russians have stopped their push near Robotina after they retook everything that the Ukrainians took from their counteroffensive. But maybe you should try to try to prevent the Ukrainians that are in the Zaporozhye direction from moving to other sectors, because this area has been quiet, so the Ukrainians probably are trying to pull troops away. But there's still a lot of area. Even if they are just here to just pin down Ukrainian troops, there's still some tactical victories the Russians could do here. Not only I think one of the main looks like the main section here that the Russians are trying to do is take these line of villages here, because if they could take these villages, then they'll cut off one of the main highways and roads that supply Orekov. Now that doesn't mean Orekov will be completely cut off. They still have a bunch of highways that help it, but this will advance the Russian positions a bit more on the western side of the Zaporozhye Oblast. In fact, we have some sources showing that the Russians have taken some of these fields to the north of Kalinonovko here and are reaching the village of Mala Shirobrenka and Shirobrenka. So, looks like there's some movement here in this western part of Zaporozhye. So we shall see if the Russians continue moving towards Lubovka and towards Mala Shirobrenka. But some small progress here, but we shall monitor it. And then also, surprisingly, there's been some changes in the Kherson direction. Just a small one. It looks like the Russians are activated, are now advancing to the village of Dashna. I think they're trying to basically clear out and have a very solid position on the other side of the Dnieper Oblast. Again, this Dnieper campaign is the battle for the islands. These islands between the one side of the Volga River and on the other side. And so the battle is basically and one of the main areas that the Ukrainians have on the other side of the Dnieper River is in the village of Dashna. And this week, the Russians have basically moved from their positions in Olezhevsky and have taken this area right here. And it looks like they're now battling for Dashna. So the Russians could take this little village. They'll have a very good position to hold the Ukrainians back. Have a very strong position on the Dnieper Islands here. So the battle for Dashna on the Dnieper Islands is ongoing. Alrighty, so that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Be sure to like this video, share this video around, comment your thoughts, and I hope you guys have a wonderful beginning of March. So aim high and wander on.